David, it's a pleasure to have this time to talk
Pleasure.
and talk about the issue of character and its implications, importance, and so on. For as long as I have been reading you, which is quite a number of years, it's always been refreshing to see how you weave in issues of the moral sensibilities, the moral sense of human beings, and how consequential it is in human affairs. Now you're working very explicitly on a project dealing with character. Can you tell us what character is?
Yeah, I guess character is involved in a specific activity. It's not just a general thing. It's not just a collection of good traits. The activity it's involved in is a combat. It's combat against weakness. It's combat against things like pride. It's combat against ignorance. It's an awareness. It's a set of traits you have when you're fighting your own weaknesses. So I think it has to be understood in almost a battle campaign, that you wake up every day and there are certain things you're going to be tempted by, and there are certain weaknesses you're going to have. Maybe you're lazy, maybe you're slothful. Mm-hmm. And so character is two things. One, it's the repertoire of strengths that you have to combat, say, your laziness. And then it's your style of fighting the campaign. And so you may have a natural industriousness, or you may have just a sense, I've got to sit down and begin writing, say, if you write. And that ability to stick to it and to have that strength of industriousness, that is a piece of your character. So to me, if you don't think of it as a part of the struggle against temptation and sin, then you're sort of missing the central activity.
Where does it come from?
I think personality and temperament are inherited, but character is built, or as I've learned from you, engraved. Okay. And it's built from a multitude of causes. Some of it is from our culture from thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. Some of it we inherit from our religion, things were revealed. Some of it from our family, some of it from our friends, some of it from the thing we read yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would be a mistake to try to disentangle the different parts of the extremely complex ecosystem, right, which form this. And most of us act like the people around us. And so it's something that is formed subtly by the standards of behavior. Just one quick example that occurs to me is I used to do a show on PBS called The NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. And Lehrer never told me how to do the job of being a pundit. But if I did something he approved of, his face would light up a little. And if I did something he disapproved of, there would just be a little turn of the lips. So they're very subtle signals, but you're sort of inculcated with how to behave from that.
David, with your concern about character, why should other people care? Why would it matter to them? Why would it factor in to a decision that they might make about their child's schooling?
Right. Well, if I've covered a lot of people over the last 30-odd years of my career, and if there's one lesson that is the constant, it is that character is destiny. Yeah. That if you have a person who has no ability to control self, no ability to aim for virtue, no ability to, or a tendency to slide and try to compromise and cut corners, then first on a practical level, that weakness will show up and come back and hurt you. There is, C.S. Lewis makes this point, there's a central piece of ourselves. Yeah. And every decision you make is either improving that central piece, yeah, making it more orderly, or making it more disorderly. Right. And if the daily decisions of your life are making that piece more disorderly, then you're going to come a cropper. Yeah. And that's the practical reason. The second reason is you just will not be a person worth admiring and worth admiring of yourself. That if you are not willing to renounce things. Right. And then finally, if you're a believer, then you want to live in a way that honors God's creation. And so I do think for those three, the profane, the moral, and the spiritual, right, pretty strong incentives, I'd say.
Yeah, all the way around.
Yeah.
Has there been a loss of character, a loss of our capacity for character? How would you describe the dilemma that we have right now?
I'd say there's certainly been a loss of our ability to articulate character. So I'm not sure people are more worse off. I'm not sure they're committing adultery more. I think they're probably doing some things a little less, like drinking to access and things like that. But I think if you ask people about certain categories of thought or certain categories of behavior, if you ask people to form judgments, they're less good at it than they were 50 or 60 years ago. And so there are certain words like virtue and vice. Mm-hmm. There are certain moral frameworks. The famous way of putting it is Alistair MacIntyre's way, which is that imagine we had words like gravity and eclipse or solar system, but we didn't have a framework to which to understand physics.
Right.
And so we have words like virtue and character and sin, but we don't have the overall framework anymore of how it all fits together. And so I think finding how it all fits together, finding that framework is the central challenge of people like us who do what we do, or at least understanding what people are coming up with.
But one of the master narratives of our moment in history, it seems to me, and not just within the United States, but globally, is a narrative of fragmentation.
Yeah.
And all of our efforts to try to bring coherence, bring unity, whether in the realm of international relations, you think about the struggles with the European Union, for example. I mean, at every level of human experience, fragmentation seems to be, if not the leading story, certainly one of them. How do you create that moral framework that provides the coherence and the vocabulary?
Yeah, there obviously is a lot of fragmentation, and it's a paradox in an age of instant communications, but I do think it's happening. But people have done it in the past, and I think a lot of this is about rediscovery. I don't think it's about creation. If you were in Augustine's world, say, you were in a very diverse world, and not only diverse across thousands of miles, but diverse across 10 miles, because people weren't traveling. And yet, a guy like the North African guy like that, living however many, 1,500 years ago, can write a book or a series of books that are perfectly comprehensible to us today. And so I think we had an inheritance either, well, just take the Western civilization, a dialogue between people like Pericles and people like Augustine that was channeled and understood and reconciled. Right. You have a colleague at University of Virginia named Paul Cantor who wrote a book about Hamlet. Right. And he talks about what is Hamlet. Hamlet is a guy who has one foot in the world of Achilles. Somebody killed my father, I should kill him. That is my honor. And somebody in the world of Christianity, don't kill. And he's caught between these two worlds, and he's a character who's caught in two long traditions trying to find a reconciliation. Yeah. And so I think we're still living in these flow of ideas. And I think the task is not necessarily to create new ones, but to figure out what the ideas that we've inherited and modernize them for today.
Okay. Does rediscovery, on the one hand, and the implementation of that rediscovery and the formation of young people require certain kinds of social conditions that may have existed in the past but don't exist today, or that are harder to find today?
Well, paradoxically, because life was much rougher until modern affluence, they had a more humble sense, because they really could die at any moment. Yeah. Their children could die. And so the world was just much more unforgiving. And then as a result, they paid attention to discipline. If your 12-year-old is watching the family flock of sheep, then you really have no margin of error in how that 12-year-old is going to behave. If they mess up, they have destroyed your income. And so you're going to be very rigorous in enforcing certain standards of behavior on that person.
Right.
If today your 12-year-old, loses his Nintendo,
Right.
And so a more forgiving world has in some way made it less demanding upon us to instill disciplines of behavior. And none of us want to go back to the days of shepherding, but it's about that discipline of behavior that is the challenge.
Right. So those social conditions were ones in which children were economically productive within the family, and the family survival depended.
Right.
That's not the case so much in any case in the upper middle professional classes.
Right.
Maybe it's increasingly true as the lower middle class and working class faces all sorts of strains economically, financially, that they haven't for a while.
Right.
I don't know.
I think it's definitely worth always thinking about these in class segmentation terms, because I do think we live in a very segmented society behaviorally. Mm-hmm. And so members of the educated class face this weird paradox where the pressures of competition get more ferocious every year. And so to even get into a college becomes a much harder exercise for the educated.
Right.
And so they have to orient themselves in a meritocratic direction in a very early age, and they have to think in terms strategically in terms of meritocracy. And I taught a class at Yale, which is obviously extremely hard to get into. And at the end of the class, at the last session, it was senior class. This was our last session. In fact, it was the last session that they were ever going to have of any class at Yale. So at the very end of their senior year, I read them a passage from a guy named Carl Weintraub, who was a legendary great books professor at the University of Chicago, where I went. And it was about how to treat the classics. And he said, when you read a book like Machiavelli, or you read a book like, I don't know, Hegel or any Aristotle, you have to remember these men and women poured their blood and treasure into it. Yeah. And that for them it was a matter of life and death, and you have to treat it with respect, that at least as much as they did. And I'm not doing justice to the full passage, but I read them this, and then I said to them, well, okay, you've been through 4 years, this is the end. What books have you been assigned over the 4 years where it has made that kind of difference in your life? Long silence, and then kid finally says, we really don't read that way. We're so busy, we got so many student activities, we read just enough to get prepared for class. Yeah. And so we're not investing that much in these books. Right. And another one piped up and said, yeah, that's true, but I set aside a couple that I'd like to read after college that I'm hoping to get into. Right. And I felt like saying to him, I have news for you. If you didn't have time to read in college, you're not going to have time after. Yeah. And so their professional mentality is set on I just got to get through the next hurdle. And so that's one set of challenges for them. And then for the less educated and the less affluent, they've got the problems of social disorganization to deal with, neighborhoods without dads, crime rates, family breakup. And that's a different set of challenges. And it's interesting to ask which is doing better. And that's actually not an easy question to ask. Right. In some ways, the kids down here are doing better. In some ways, the kids up here are doing behaviorally, obviously up here. But in terms of understanding the world, in many ways, the kids who have had more challenges have a deeper and richer understanding of themselves in the world. Right.
Well, at the University of Virginia, I see these students all the time, the ones that game the system. Yeah. And game their studies in a way. And it's not done cynically so much. It's just done with a very different attitude about studying in order to, as a kind of form of consumption, right. In order to, toward performative ends, right. Versus studying to absorb and to have what you read and absorb change your life.
Yeah. I once interviewed the guy, he's retired now, but for 30 years he was the admissions director of Princeton. Mm-hmm. And he said you can go into school with a poetic frame of mind or a professional frame of mind. Right. And he said my students are going in professionally. Yeah. And in my class, one of the characters I taught them was Dorothy Day, and I wanted them to read the passage where she's talking about reading Dostoevsky. Mm-hmm. Because she's reading it as if her life depends on it. She like a sense that these people have a truth I need. Yeah. And she did it on her own. It wasn't part of a class. But getting people to read in that seriousness is part of what we try to do as teachers, but it's phenomenally hard because of the time pressures.
No, that's right. So I mentioned the issue of social conditions, and let me mention one of them, and that's the introduction and proliferation of new communications technologies for entertainment, for communicating, and so on. There's an 8-year gap between our second-born and our third-born child. Our third-born was our tenure decision.
Yes, so, I've been through that. Yeah. I got one too.
So But that 8-year gap was the difference between the beginnings of email with our middle child and our oldest, and then text messaging, instant messaging, all of that stuff. And those adolescent years, raising our thirdborn was fundamentally different because of those technologies. And I just mentioned that as illustrative of how, of a different environment in which we as parents were trying to raise a child who would be thoughtful, reflective, engaging, and yet, you know, multitasking, trying to write, trying to read, holding communications. You know the situation well.
Yeah, no, I'm in the middle of it too, and I've looked at the research such as it exists already. Yeah. And I'm, in some ways, slightly less alarmed on some things. So, for example, there was a theory that Facebook was going to destroy friendships, that we would just have electronic friendships, they wouldn't have real friendships. I think the evidence is that's not true, that it's not what Facebook does, it's what you bring to Facebook. If you have normal, healthy friendships, you use Facebook to augment them. If you're lonely, you use Facebook to mask your loneliness. So the technology is not changing you, what you bring is. There are other issues where there are two issues where I'm more alarmed. One is attention span. And I don't even have to talk about kids, I can talk about myself. I think it's just harder to maintain attention span if you're used to the rhythm of, say, your text message. The one way to drive mice crazy in a lab is to give them irregularly timed rewards. And so an email is sort of like an irregularly timed reward. You think, oh, this next one is going to be interesting. All the last ones were not, but you think the next one is, oh, something happened. And so you're checking and you're that. The second thing, and this more applies, I think, to young people who are in that culture, is the transfer from words and even paragraphs and blogs to Reddit and 4chan, which are really just series of images with little taglines. And the addictiveness to them of that, oh, here's a witticism, here's a witticism. And I do think it's hard for them, first to read after spending their life with that, but especially to write. I think the prose styles have gotten incredibly casual as a result, and no one knows how to use commas. But
and they're not paying attention to words.
Right. And the other thing that leaps to mind is there's a Twitter persona and a 4chan or a Reddit persona, which is ironical and sarcastic all the time. It's a series of twists. And that's fine, that's fun, but you want them to have some other persona.
Well, Jedediah Purdy, in that book on irony, pointed out some of the problems that have only intensified in a way. They certainly haven't gone away, of a kind of self-distancing mechanism that irony provides from real attachment to a belief or to a cause or to...
The one thing which is a mystery to me is how much... It's always danger to look at the cultural input going into a brain and assume you understand what effect it's going to have, if any, or how it's going to turn out. And so, you know, society is obviously, the media is much more sex-drenched than it used to be. And yet it's not clear that young people are any more promiscuous. In fact, there's some evidence to the contrary. And so I have this debate with my third, who's now 14 years old. He listens to rap, and he listens to some stuff I find hard to stomach. We have a rule when he listens in the car that if there's one song that offends my sensibility, he's lost the rap privileges for the whole ride. So he has to carefully pick songs that will appeal to somebody my age. But what effect is that having, some of the vulgarity, some of the... I really do not know the answer to that question.
So let me ask you, and if you want to... I'm going to ask you more of a personal question, but you don't feel any obligation to respond in a personal way. But you have you talked about the distraction of technology for yourself, but you've also written on a number of occasions. One op-ed I remember in particular, and sent to my kids, called "The Frozen Gaze." You know, about habit and about the focus of major league pitchers. And how they have this capacity to focus. People want to know, because they don't have the resources available to them in what feels like a new environment. What is the advice for raising children to create space for attention? Is it a losing cause? The family is a weak institution, relatively
Right,
speaking. Entertainment, technology are strong institutions.
Right.
How would you advise people? How would
Yeah.
you think about it yourself
Yeah.
and for your
Well,
own?
if I remember that column, and my memory of my own columns is lamentable, it may have been based on running across a philosopher who was really a sports coach
Right.
named,
Yeah.
I forgot his name, Bradford or something like that.
Right.
So my sons are pitchers, baseball pitchers.
Are they? Okay.
And like all pitchers, and especially one of my oldest sons who's a lefty, sometimes lefties are more delicate instruments than righties, and occasionally get control issues. And so a guy who played AAA baseball, who was his coach, gave him this book and said, we all read this book. And it's called The Mental ABCs of Pitching. And I read it just for fun, and it was philosophy. I mean, he thought he was writing about pitching, but he's really writing about life.
Yeah.
And it's about, first of all, the regimentation of what you want to do. If you want to have a controlled experience and have control, first of all, you've got to build habits around it. And so some pitchers put their water bottle in the same spot. They do the same thing. They have the same voice in their head. And as he was writing, he didn't make this point, but I was reminded of a point Tom Wolfe wrote in the book called The Right Stuff,
Right.
that every airline you get on, when the pilot comes over the loudspeaker, they all have Chuck Yeager's voice. There's a certain calmness to how they all want to present themselves. And that is just the ethos of the pilot.
Right.
And so the pitcher wants to have that calm voice and never get too high, never get too low. And then certain rituals on the mound. Once you get on the mound, there's the rubber there. You should only concentrate on three things: the catcher's glove, the pitch selection, and the velocity. And if you find yourself thinking about anything other than those three things, step off. And he mentions talking to Greg Maddux, who was a great pitcher, without many great physical blessings, but who became a great pitcher. And after the game, he said to Greg Maddux, how'd you do today? And Maddux said, 68 out of 80. And what he meant by that was the ball left his fingers properly 68 times out of 80. After it left his fingers, he had no control over it. So that was not how he's going to evaluate the game. It was how it left his fingers. And so this is about developing a superstructure and an attitude about what you can control and what you can't. And I found the book continually profound in ways the author did not notice, or maybe did.
Yeah, right. Is there a corollary in the area of character formation, in the ways that parents or educators think about the cultivation of habits of virtue?
Yeah, well, one of the things it's important to emphasize is characters and self-discipline in particular can be domain-specific. So I wrote a column once about discipline, and I used as an example Tiger Woods. Well, on the golf course, he is a very disciplined guy.
Right.
In private life, not so much.
Right.
And so it's important to remember that being a tremendously disciplined in one sphere doesn't necessarily carry over.
Right.
Now, as for education, one of the things that is humbling to those of us in the teaching business is there's relatively little evidence that debating a moral philosophy makes you a better moral philosopher. There's a line in Edward Gibbon, I can't remember what the context was, but it applies to some character education, which is that it only worked on those whose happy nature rendered it unnecessary.
Right.
Meaning there are some people who are just good and they love character education.
Right.
There are those people who are morally questionable and it's not going to work on them.
Right.
And so that's the challenge of the business.
Right.
But I think one of the things we can do is give people the vocabulary. If they're of sufficient motivation, they know how to organize their motivation.
Politics and character. At the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture in the year 2000, we did a survey on the politics of character. And of course, this is at the end of the Clinton decade.
Right.
And what we found is that people wanted politicians to have a certain amount of character, but not too much.
Yeah. Huh.
They wanted enough character that a person would be principled, but they didn't want too much character. They wanted, someone like Al Gore or George W. Bush, but they didn't want Alan Keyes. You know, in part because too much character smacked of extremism or dogma. What's your thought about that, and particularly as you survey the culture of politics in Washington?
Right. Well, I would agree with that. I would certainly agree with the Alan Keyes part. But, you know, politics is a team sport, and it involves moral compromise to do good. Machiavelli put it that sometimes you have to love your country more than your own soul.
Yeah.
And so in order to do good, sometimes you have to make compromises.
Right.
And so you don't want somebody who's going to be rigidly attached to a set of ideals that'll render them ineffective. And one of the things that bugs me about our public culture now is that we're too unforgiving of scandal, in a way.
Right.
And sometimes the country is reasonably forgiving of scandal, and the Clinton years was an example of that.
Right.
So I think it's a mundane profession. And like any profession, it involves certain compromises.
Right.
Certainly column writing involves a lot of moral challenges and compromises. In journalism, we're basically gossips who are invading people's privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And politics, team sport, how much do you surrender your own personal views to the team? How much do you shade the truth in order to get elected?
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid the narcissism of being the center of attention all the time?
Right.
So these are severe character challenges, and you want somebody who has a certain ruthless flexibility to be an SOB, but an SOB for a good cause.
Well, let me end with two questions. One is the observation, or at least the possibility, that the person with character is actually the one who does compromise.
Yeah.
Is transparent about that. We oftentimes think of character as being utterly principled.
Right.
But in the realm of politics, do you think that that's possible, or that's true?
Yeah. Well, one of my heroes is Reinhold Niebuhr, and he said you have to take morally hazardous action to get anything done. And the world is just not structured so that good triumphs all the time. Sometimes, say you're president, you're being attacked by terrorists, you sometimes have to use drones, or you have to use violent means. And you have to be able to live with that. At the same time, you don't use it as an excuse to say, okay, everything is permitted.
Right.
And I'm a little dubious there are any hard and fast rules about that.
Right. Okay. So one final question would be, it's not so hard retroactively to look through history and find persons of great moral character, discernment, but also courage and character. Surveying the contemporary scene, we have, it seems to me, we have largely replaced moral exemplars with celebrities.
Right.
But, you know, looking through the fog of celebrity,
Right.
who would you identify out there, people who might be recognizable to average Americans, who you think have extraordinary character?
You know, I keep a list of, so I get depressed about Washington, I try to keep a list of people who are really good, who are doing.
Yeah.
And to be honest, if you go into a government agency, the quality of the people is very high.
Yeah.
They don't make much money, but they're very committed to their jobs, and there are a million people who are like that.
Right.
Just to list a few who I think would be more publicly recognizable, who I've covered. There are people who, when they do a job, it's not about them, it's about the job they're in. The job comes with certain tasks, and they're going to do the tasks the job requires.
Right.
And so one of my heroes, he's now 93 years old, is a guy named George Shultz, who was Secretary of State under Reagan,
Right.
and then earlier under Nixon. And just steady, doing the job, not calling attention to himself. Somebody like that, I mentioned earlier, Jim Lehrer, whose show was not about him, it was about the news. And then even some younger ones. I think we're seeing in some ways a group of young senators who I find a new type of senator, not as pompous as some of the old ones. There's a woman from Minnesota named Amy Klobuchar, who's very refreshing and I think very natural, and I think is trying to do the right thing. On the Republican side, I'm a fan of Lindsey Graham, for example, from South Carolina, who's trying to be independent, respect his state, trying to square a lot of circles. And that's the sort of thing you want from somebody. There's a senator from Oregon named Ron Wyden, who's really risked a lot to work with people on the Republican side. even though he's pretty liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you actually stop to look around the people around you, you find most of them, I think, are reasonably impressive, a few bad apples. But
Right.
the individual quality of our members of Congress, at least of the Senate, is higher, I think, than it's been. The system itself is the worst it's ever been.
Right.
But it's good individuals in a bad system.
Yeah, interesting. Great.
So.
David, thanks very much.
Okay, thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.